Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity Project, sitting down for part two of my conversation with Matt Taylor. A link to our first conversation will be in the description. Also put a link in there to a book that Matt wrote called Voluntary Exchange, isn't it? Yeah, Voluntary Exchange. So if anyone wants to check that out, the link will be in the description. Our last conversation, we spoke about many things to do with property rights and self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, as well as the Nations of Sanity Project. And I think we'll just kind of kick off. I'm not really sure where we kind of left off in the last conversation, but was there anything particularly burning in your mind that you wanted to speak about from before? Or
yeah, I mean, I guess one of my beefs with when people are talking about these things and talking about how society could be better, which I firmly believe in, is there's often a kind of a point in the conversation when people start saying we. So they say, first of all, self-ownership and understanding that, okay, we get that. But then there's a point when they say, and we will have laws that do this, or we will agree that these are the black and white areas. And I think to myself, well, who's we? Who's agreeing? Because if you think of your society coming together and adopting, your principle of self-ownership, which I think it should, that's going to be bit by bit. That you can't get everyone that might come into your society in a room on a day and say, right, we need to agree all this and this and this and this, black and white areas, whatever you might want to call them. It just becomes vast, and the possibility of agreeing dwindles very quickly to almost zero. So then you're left with the question, okay, let's say we've joined a society on the basis we've come together and said we all believe in the self-ownership principle. That means you can't kill and you can't steal. It means property rights and personal rights, if you like. That's okay. We all sign up to that. But the disputes that you and I have, or that we each have with other people, are going to turn on all sorts of interpretations. What were the facts, and who determines what the facts were? What are the rules of evidence, and who determines that? Anyway, so my point is, I'm interested in, who is that we, and if there isn't a we, then how does this society work?
yeah, okay, right. Well, basically, from my point of view, with what I'm promoting with the Nations of Sanity and this whole idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as the law, and there's I kind of break it into two aspects. You've got this this black and white standard of what we understand the non-aggression principle to be, and then this kind of gray area, this fuzzy edges. And I suppose what I'm trying to do with this whole idea of this peace agreement is to segregate those two areas. So because I feel like we need a different approach to each. So we can have our basic agreement to make the non-aggression principle the law, and one of the key things about that is understanding like why the non-aggression principles are law. It's not just because I said so or you said so, but because we're basing that on a concept, and the concept is self-ownership, the idea that everyone has right over only their own self. So that's kind of like the basis of this peace agreement. We're basically saying, okay, well, these are the terms of peace between us. It's based on this concept that everyone has right over only their own selves, and then to a certain extent, obviously presupposing a basic consensus of objective reality, which there could still be dispute over when you get down to like the specific scenarios. But moving forward, what we're saying is you're taking that principle based on that concept and you're combining it with an objective consensus of reality. So like like things that we can determine as a matter of fact, like how we agree the world is constructed, that we're individual human beings, and et cetera, like people can pick the holes out of everything. We have to agree on a certain consensus of reality, even if it's relatively low resolution, so it can be nice and universal, but also objective and scientific, not so fuzzy that we want to we're not trying to accommodate everybody with a different opinion, no matter how arbitrary that difference is. We want to create something that's universal in an objective sense, that's something that's not down to where we're minimizing subjectivity and we're making it as objective as possible. Where we can establish something as a fact, that's what we do. And then when we have like the principle guiding over how we act based on this fact, that's what we have is the non-aggression principle. So that's kind of like, sorry, go on.
Can I just pick up, because you're saying we.
Yeah.
You keep saying we, and my question is, who is that? Because it seems to me that if we're all self-owners, then there is no law, there is no agreement on anything except one that everyone has accepted. So let's just imagine, yeah?
Oh, no, okay. Well,
you're telling me to accept something. I can't see how that.
Okay. Well, okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, what I would say is the we is like, so we were talking about establishing this peace agreement and this terms of peace and this. So the we is the we that do that. You know, like if we're going to get together to do that much, then this is the basis on which we're going to do it. It's kind of like saying, look, okay, you know, I'm saying that we're all individual self-owners and all the rest of it. Now, we could all just live informally as self-owning individuals, and maybe people will violate each other and maybe they won't, and whatever. You know, the moral reality of it and how people conduct themselves aren't exactly the same thing. You know, I can say that even during the days of slavery, all of those people that were enslaved as a moral reality were free individuals. They just weren't treated as free individuals. They were treated as slaves. You know, it's like I know it seems like a pedantic point, but this is what I'm talking about in like how we're applying this. We're basically saying, okay, this is the reality that we're all having this terms of peace. This is peace agreement that we're all accepting. So everyone that's accepting this peace agreement is accepting, with a very basic consensus of reality, this principle, this moral principle. Now, people don't have to accept that and whatever, but my point is about the whole idea of enforcing the non-aggression principle as a law, because obviously a law is like a threat of force, you know, you're enforcing it with force. The whole idea of doing that is the people that agree to those terms of peace, okay, well, you've got their consent, that's all well and good. The people that don't agree to those terms of peace, it's like, okay, well, you don't have their consent, but where's their moral complaint? Where's their complaint about a right of theirs that's being violated if they're not accepting the concept of that self-owning right in the first place? You know, it's like, what I'm saying is like, people don't have to accept self-ownership, but what we're saying is this peace agreement is for everybody that does. And even people that don't have to, they don't have to anything about, this is about formalizing it. I suppose that's the key thing. It's about formalizing it. You know, we could, sorry, if you want to interject.
I was going to ask, have you drafted the agreement? You know what sort of clause 5 and clause 6 are. Not to be too sort of again pedantic about it, but when I've thought about it, you know, it's really tough when you start to think about, well, okay, so if everyone has got to, if the only rules are rules that everyone voluntarily consents to, and you may disagree with that, but that's my conclusion. Then what are they? Because of course, a living, breathing society is going to have people joining all the time, even if it's just young people becoming of age. But I would imagine, you know, if you're starting at one person or two people in your society, then there's going to be a long period of growth with adults joining. My point is, whatever you know, if you and I start this society, yeah, and we agree, we set down, well, we believe, you know, this is the black and this is the white, okay? As soon as someone comes along who has a slightly different view of what the black and the white is, where the gradient, where the objective truth, if you like, leaves off and the grasslands begin, the mix begins, then we're either going to have to all get together and change it, you know, and change what's in the fundamental law, or we're going to have to say to him or her, sorry, you can't join because your view of reality is, or your view of what sensible rules is slightly different.
Okay, well, this is why we need to, through this peace agreement, and yeah, it does. I mean, I've written it out in a 3-part format, so it's kind of like a low resolution format, if you like, but it's basically setting out the 3 dimensions of agreement that are required. So I'm saying it's not just we all need to agree to make the non-aggression principle the law and that's that. It's basically saying there's 3 dimensions to this agreement. There's the basic agreement, which is part 1, which is the basic agreement to establish this principle as law based on this concept. Part two is called The Lines in the Sand, which is about basically setting limits of tolerance over differing interpretations, about defining that black and white. And then part three is about ratifying rightful ownership, again, through this principle. Now, going back to part two, which is the crux of what you're talking about, and what this peace agreement really is about, and what this project, to be honest, is really about, is basically saying what we need to do. The approach that I'm kind of proposing is basically saying what we need to do is we need to segregate what we're calling the black and white. Now, we're calling it that, but we've got to segregate what we're going to call the black and white. Well, where we're going to draw the line in the sand and say, this is our limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. So we're not going to accept your differing opinion past here. We'll go to war with you if we have to. We'll fight you if we have to. Like, this is our line in the sand. Like, if it, like for an age of consent, it would be the minimum and the maximum, but there's a gray area in between. And there's loads of areas where this can apply. So what we're doing is we're going to segregate. We're going to say, okay, we're going to give you this big area, what we'll call the gray area, where we're going to have differing opinions, but we're going to accept that it's reasonable that we have those differing opinions. That's why we're calling it the gray area. We're not, although we're going to disagree exactly where we draw the line in the gray area, we need to have a consensus about what is the gray area by drawing this limit of tolerance that defines what we're calling the black and white. Now, this is where I'm saying, this is where subjectivity, this is where our desire for objectivity and the inescapable reality of subjectivity collide, because we can be as objective as humanly possible. Like, it's like our consensus of basic reality. It's like, who am I to say that this is how it is? Who am I to say that your belief in religious belief or whatever that might supersede self-ownership is not, that's all well and good, but now we're having a dispute over objective reality. Now we're crossing over that black and white line. The point of this peace agreement is to basically say, look, we don't have to agree on the gray areas. All we need to do is find this universal understanding of the black and white, this limit of tolerance that we can universalize and say, we don't care what society you're part of, we don't care your culture, any of that sort of stuff. No further. This is where you go no further. Just to use the age of consent as a good example of that, you could have different nations, communities, even individuals, and this is where we'll get into the minutiae of people coming into communities of children and all the rest of it. But you can have all of these different people practicing different ages of consent in a gray area within this little pocket where we say, okay, well, we'll agree this is a gray area. We'll agree we're not sure if you're an adult or a child in here, but past this point, you're definitely a child, and past this point, you're definitely an adult. It's a little bit more complicated. I use age of consent because it's nice to demonstrate it with numbers, like nothing below here, nothing above there. In reality, it would be more complicated than that, even, because you're going to have mental competency and things like that also come into play. You could have a 30-year-old who would still have a guardian in the same way that an 8-year-old would, because they don't have the mental capacity they're not competent adults. They're not, it's not just about being an adult, it's about being a competent adult, But what I'm saying is it's like, and I don't know if I used this example in our previous conversation, but I have this article called The Desert and the Grassland, where I talk about this distinction. I use it as a metaphor for the distinction between what's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle and what's definitely not. And say, look, you got the desert, you got the grassland, you got the area in between. And what we're saying is, look, you can still keep the distinction just because there's this fuzzy area in between no one can say for sure about. The fact that no one can say for sure about it means that no one can really enforce it on anybody. But we have to draw a line eventually, otherwise we lose the distinction altogether. We have to be able to say, okay, at this point, if there is such a thing as a desert and a grassland, at this point it's definitely the desert. And the same with this principle. If there is such a thing as self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, if that principle exists at all, then at this point we can say it's definitely being violated. If there is such a distinction between child and adult, we can say at this point you're definitely a child, you're definitely adult. And the fuzzy area in between, it still needs to be dealt with, but what we're saying is that's separate. We're saying the black and white is this universal law that we enforce and we impose, and that's where and if we disagree, then it's the realm of violence, unfortunately. But we're saying the gray area, that's something that we can peacefully negotiate, and often self-ownership will illuminate where the authority lies to kind of decipher the gray area, because to use age of consent as an example, and although communities can voluntarily build, get together voluntarily to have like a community-wide age of consent, the person who would actually have the default authority for age of consent within the grey, not past the black and white limits that we're setting universally, but within the grey, would be the parent. Because like all grey areas of parenting, that kind of discretionary authority, if you like, would fall within the parent, because the parent is the guardian, the rightful guardian of that child, the one who owns the duty of care. It's a little bit like, sorry, I know I'm going on a bit, but it's a little bit like when people have debates over the best way to raise their child, there's a fine line between that debate and child abuse. You know what I mean? And what we're saying is okay, well, we can draw a line and say, when you're actually abusing your child, we can step in, take your child from you, use force and all the rest of it, because you are violating there. It's not grey area anymore. It's black and white. But if it's grey area, if we think, oh, I don't like your parenting, but you haven't crossed that line yet, then we can use all sorts of peaceful methods to try to, persuade you to go a better way and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, that discretionary power would be with you to decide how best to raise your child, because you are the rightful guardian. Sorry, I went on there loads, but I hope that gave you a bit of.
I talk about our society as sort of a society based on these rules, and if you think that's not a sort of reasonable way to go about it, then tell me. But that sort of helps me to hang things on. So in our society, is there a legislature? Is there a parliament? Is there someone, or a king or whatever, who is allowed to make rules that the rest of us didn't agree with? Let's say, some new area. So the internet arrives, or some new technology arrives. Yeah, there is no rule for it because no one had previously agreed what the black and the white was. So how is it made? Has someone been delegated to make rules?
Right. Well, the thing is we can have collectives like that. So we can have collectives with all of that kind of structure, including courts and all the rest of it. And we can delegate authority, and we can have additional rules that have nothing to do with the non-aggression principle for various standards and all the rest of it. But all of that would have to be within that realms of a voluntary agreement. So if we all agreed to be, let's say, for example, we had a regulated market that had all of these rules within the regulated market, and anyone that voluntarily was part of that regulated market, be it a business or a consumer, participating in it, would obviously then be beholden to those rules. But they're not laws that are being forced on them regardless of whether they consent with violence. They're rules that they are agreeing to as part of their it's a little bit like if I say, if you want to come into my house, you've got to take your shoes off. That's not me saying it's illegal for you to wear shoes in your own house. It's like it's part of a voluntary agreement. So you can have things like that. But let's say, for example, my community, let's say, we had our little Nations of Sanity revolution tomorrow.
I'm interested
cool.
in that sort of, I think you didn't call it that, but I'm calling it the society level. So you've got voluntary collectives below that.
Yeah.
Understand. But the top level, which is what I think which is the tough bit. It's a tough bit because it's very hard to leave. It's very hard to, be out of society completely. I can't imagine it. I can join one collective and get bored with it and say, well, I don't want to go to the book club anymore. I want to go to this, or whatever it might be. But it's the whole difficulty comes from the fact that each of us has to be in society somehow. The bigger the society, the better, and that gives these problems about who's.
But the thing is, though, that for me, that kind of, I feel like that helps my point, because that incentivizes our voluntary collectivization. Like that incentivizes us to have, like, what I'm saying is like, if my community wanted to have some kind of collective where they had like courts and systems and all the rest of it, and they had additional rules that had nothing to do with the non-aggression principle, but I didn't want to be part of it. I just said the whole time that you guys carry on, but I don't want to be part of it. They couldn't force me. They couldn't physically force me. They couldn't impose any law, quote unquote, on me, other than the non-aggression principle law, which we can all impose on each other. They couldn't do any of that. But what they could do is have nothing to do with me. And then it would become very difficult for me to continue to live in that community when, like, you know, like what I'm saying is it, like, because they can still have their shops that have these whatever rule and stuff like that, you know, and all of these things. And I'm free. They're not doing any of those things. But it's within, there's a kind of inherent incentive already there for us to come to these negotiations where we say, okay, well, we do want to all be part of the same collective. It would make sense for us to say, let's say, all be part of a local thing where we all contribute to the maintenance of the roads, for example, in our local area, or to have but the thing is about it, the reason why it's good to not have that imposed on us, to always have the option of opting out, even though more often than not it wouldn't be worth opting out, it would be better for us not to. But the reason why it's important to always have that freedom of choice there, even if it's almost superficial in many ways because it's just not practical, but that gives us, that's the power against the corruption and bureaucracy that's inherent in all these coercive systems. You know, it's like if my council tax goes too high, or if the local bin collection's not doing what I want them to do, I don't have any choice. I've still got to pay my council tax. If the NHS isn't providing me a service that I want, I don't have any choice. I've still got to contribute to it. You know, it's like all the time I've got that opt-out clause, I've got a little bit of power with regards to you know, more reminiscent to the sort of democratic power that people crave within their societies, where they have real control as an actual, you know, as an actual voice, as someone who can say, okay, well, look, I can't force you all to go along with how I want it, but I don't have to be a part of how you're all going along with it as well. And if I got to go and live in the woods to make that work, then I'll go and live in the woods, or I can stay living in my house, because no one can, this is the thing, it's like no one could force me to leave. You know what I mean? They could all just not have anything to do with me, and I'd have to hire some private garbage collection and or whatever, and maybe I'd get my groceries delivered from somewhere else. And you know what I mean? Like I say, there's lots of incentives, and this is why we're not powerless in the grey area. Just because I always say, look, we can only enforce the black and white as this universal law, we can still establish standards within the grey areas. We're not powerless in there. We can, but we're doing it outside of the violence of law enforcement, and we're doing it within the realms of something that we're negotiating as rules and regulations within a system that people have the choice to be part of. But the fact that they have that choice means those systems then have an obligation to be worth making that choice, you know, because like I sort
of feel that you're not purposely evading it. I wouldn't say that, but I think you posit kind of two layers, more than two possibly, but two categories. One I'm calling society, and the other I'm calling voluntary collectives. And you say society, it's more like a concept in a sense, because it is just the principle of self-ownership, or principle of non-aggression, whatever you might call it. There's nothing else in there that someone would look for in deciding to join your society. Because
not the overarching thing, no.
All those things you're saying will be a voluntary collective.
Yeah.
In that case, I'm interested in exploring what is the voluntary collective. You know, in a sense, I call it society, and I think it should be there at that level, but it doesn't really matter which level it's at. That is the hard question: how a society works.
Well,
the answers that have been given so far, you know, in history, are that we will have someone or some group of people chosen by God or elections or whatever it is, who will make rules. And there's a funny story, and I've forgotten where it comes from. You may recognize it or not, and it's very short, but the story is of the queen who wanted to rule for a day. And she persuaded her husband, the king, to let her have the supreme power. And on that day, she had the king killed and reigned forever. The point is, if you're allowed to make the rules for a day, then you can make your rule eternal. And broadly speaking, that's what kings have done, and that's what parliaments have done. But that rule completely breaks the self-ownership principle, because those people, whether it's 1 or 600 or whatever it is, now claim that what they say is sovereign, which basically means self-ownership out the door, we decide. And that's the question I think that most of thinking about politics and society is based on. What's the best way? Is it king? Is it democracy? Is it this? And I say, no, you have a fundamental law, which is the non-aggression principle or self-ownership principle, and you have a dispute resolution mechanism. And that's what you need. So whereas legislatures or parliaments or kings are rulers, they get to make up new laws. I say, I would like to join a society where there's only one law, and that's the, call it self-ownership principle or live and let live principle, whatever you like, written in a little bit at great length, and a dispute resolution mechanism. Because a dispute resolution mechanism, like a jury, does not set up a class of people called jurymen or called parliamentarians or called electors or whatever it might be, who then have the right to make rules. It simply says that every time there's a dispute between two citizens or members of society, a jury will decide. And that jury obviously is, because it's chosen at random, it can't form a class. Anyway, you know the point. So,
Yep.
So I say no legislator. My answer is fundamental law, very simple, that everyone can agree to. No legislative, because it would be unthinkable for some group of people to make rules for others when they haven't accepted it voluntarily. And jury as a way of, as the end result, as the last resort for a dispute that we can't solve by any other method between two people, then the jury is the way. And whether the jury, if the jury decides, as it were, that you were at fault or I was at fault in our dispute, if they decide you're at fault, they say what the restitution is that you've got to make to me. And if you make it, that's great, and everything's smooth. If you don't, you're effectively leaving society. And now whether force then comes, in a sense, you're no longer protected by any of the norms of society. So that's my schema, and I'm sort of trying to find out whether that's wrong or how it fits with your thinking.
Well, it's similar. There's definitely a lot of parallels there, particularly obviously the NAP law idea. And I think you, me, and the Live and Let Live project are of all like mind when we all agree that there's one law that needs to be here, and that is the non-aggression principle. And it's kind of like the details that need a little bit more scrutiny. I mean, the thing is, there's a few important clarifications that need to be made, but the main thing is the way I kind of view it is like when you say about how we're doing it with society, the importance of having this NAP law above is saying that the collectives that operate below this NAP law, because it's kind of like having this NAP law and then everything else is underneath that. And what we're saying is that any collective that operates can operate in any structure that the people that are part of that collective, want to organize. So I suppose the important distinction I like to make is the difference between rulers and leaders, because within those collective systems, you can have any kind of hierarchical structure that you like, and you can have leaders and representatives and all the rest of it. But the reason why those leaders wouldn't be rulers is because under the non-aggression principle law, rulers would be illegal. Like leaders are fine, but rulers would be illegal. And the distinction is that a ruler is somebody who rules over you, like with force against your will, and a leader is somebody who you can voluntarily choose. And like a ruler would be like a slave master. It's somebody who's claiming that authority over you. They're violating self-ownership. So the importance of having this peace agreement over any possible collectives that could form is we're saying, look, these collectives don't have any power that any individual doesn't have, and individuals can all collectivize and agree that, okay, this is how we're going to organize, and these are the rules that we're all accepting as part of this group, and you're out of it if you're not part of it, and all the rest of it. That's all fine. Now, just to go to the higher level though, because obviously that's fine, because how the collective work kind of sorts itself out because people are agreeing to it. So there's no real, they can't really argue. It's like a contract, you know what I mean? It's just like, you've agreed to be part of it. And if you don't want to be part of that club, then don't be part of that club. The higher level, which is this non-aggression principle, or with this, if you like, this larger society umbrella that we're talking about, having courts that you're proposing and juries and all the rest of it, I'm fine with all of that. I suppose the reason why I haven't articulated specifically how we do that is because I'm a little bit agnostic on the specifics of that. What I'm saying is there's certain things that are written in stone about the Nations of Sanity project, and there's certain things that need like need a bit of scrutiny, need a bit of maybe this would work better than that. And the things that are written in stone is the only thing that we can enforce is the non-aggression principle, like as law to everybody. Other rules, if they agree to, fine, but the only thing we can force on everyone is that. And the only way we can do it to the most objective standard, minimizing subjectivity as best we can, is to a standard of beyond reasonable doubt, reasonable certainty, which is similar to how we approach criminal law today. I know it's a statist concept, if you like, but I still think it's a valid approach to how we should approach criminal law. You know, if you're not certain someone's committed a crime, then you can't use force against them, because then the force you use is criminally negligent because it's potentially against an innocent person. By your own admission, you're not sure, you know, and this is why people are innocent until proven guilty, and this is why you need that standard of certainty, which is still not 100%. We can't be 100% on objective reality, but within that, what we call that reasonable consensus of certainty. So these juries and courts or whatever is set up specifically, and what you're talking about sounds perfectly reasonable, but what they're doing is that they're judging it in two levels. They're saying, okay, well, where's the black and white line here? That's what we'll enforce. If it's gray area, we can't enforce it. Is this part of this universal law? And if collectives have got agreements that deal with it, that's fine, but otherwise we have to treat it as it's not a violation of this law, because we can't say for certain it's not. It's a little bit like, we don't know for certain this person, there's reasonable doubt over this person being guilty of committing this murder, therefore we can't lock him up for the rest of his life. You know, we're not sure that he's innocent, but we're not sure that he's guilty. We have to err on the side of not using force against an innocent person until we've got at least a reasonable certainty that they're guilty. And we're applying the exact same thing to this universal application of the non-aggression principle law. So however we do it, however we determine it, a scientific council, if it's, like to determine the facts of it, it's a sort of thing that I'm open to more discussion on. Like I say, that's not something that I'm hard and fast, things on the Nations of Sanity that I'm hard and fast on, like my dispute about how we deal with the grey areas and saying that we can't just say, oh, communities can decide grey areas. No, that's my dispute with Live and Let Live, obviously. The reason I have a problem with that is because it's like, well, who gives them authority to do that? Now, black and white's different, because then we're making we're making assertion on reality. So I'm not claiming authority over you. I'm not saying I have authority over you. I'm saying, look, okay, at this point, we're disputing reality here. So if we have to fight because we're disputing reality and over black and white certainties, because I'm certain you committed this murder and you're certain you're not, and you didn't, or whatever it is, then okay, well then we will fight, and then it is unavoidable. But at least we can make peace in the grey area. We can make peace certainly go back to the desert grassland example. We can make peace for the grassland. We can make peace for the area in between, and then we've got the desert as our domain of violence, being the metaphor of the non-aggression principle. Does that make sense? Is to where I hope I'm not still evading the question, but
no, I think I think that the black and white, or the desert and the grassland, is a nice idea, but it isn't the core, because the problem is always that we disagree. We disagree about, a dispute arises. Obviously, there's no dispute, no problem. But when you say I did something and I say I didn't, then for all that I believe that reality is there, it's not a figment of people's imagination, but nevertheless, people's perceptions of what has happened vary, even on the most minor things.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but let me give you 3 scenarios then that play out the different ways that could play out. Okay, so me and you disagree, and it doesn't matter on the specifics, but it's basically, it's that disagreement over, where potential violence could ensue. Okay, now it could play out 3 different ways depending on whether we're part of a collective or not. So if we're not part of the same collective and we've only got the non-aggression principle law above us, then what we're basically saying is if whoever's accusing whoever of a crime, if I can't make some claim that it's a black and white certain crime, and and I've got some reasonable certainty, then I've got to leave alone. But if I think that I am certain, and then the other things I'm certain that I'm not, and we're not part of the same collective. Like obviously, if we were part of the same collective, we've already agreed that they'll make the decision for us and we'll abide by it, or we're out of the collective, or whatever terms we've agreed to. But if we're not part of it, and say either I've got a collective and my collective is going to do this, like they're going to determine it for me, but you're like, well, you're not part of that, you don't have to be beholden to it. Okay, well, what my collective can do then is they can't enforce grey area because you're not part of our collective. But if they make a decision, what they're saying, okay, well, we're saying this is black and white, it's not grey area, it's black and white, then we will enforce it against you. And if you can, and if you can find a collective, or if you can defend yourself and all the rest of it, then, like I say, if you're fighting over black and white, then you fight over black and white. I mean, it sounds like I'm just leaving people to fight over things, but what I'm saying is if it's truly a dispute over black and white, if it's truly, I'm certain that you committed a crime and you're certain that you didn't, then we are going to fight. And it is going to be about, I mean, obviously this is supposed to be an alternative to might makes right. It's about having a principle and something to lay down in front of us so that we don't go that route of violence. But I can't guarantee that it would never come to that. But what I'm saying is it will only come to that. It won't come to that over disputes over the basic, because we've got that. It won't come to disputes over the grey area because we've established how we approach what we agree is grey area. It will only come to conflict if we're actually disputing black and white discrepancies. And then it is going to be, okay, well, if you're going to actually have an argument with somebody over the black and white, then there's going to be the potential for actual conflict here, and you better have some kind of collective behind you, and they bet, or what I mean, there's going to be a potential problem there.
Yeah, but I think the black and white is far less clear, and even in your example, these, in a sense, you are leaving a bigger hole for violence or for force being used than I want. My suggestion is, at whatever level. So if we talk about the society level, the upper level, or whatever we're talking about, where you've just got a simple law, and you could call that the fundamental law of society, or you could call it the constitution of society, or whatever you wanted to call it, you will need to have some way of sorting out disputes at that level, whatever that happens in collectives. And I think, so if we think about what is that mechanism, I think you'll come back to the jury. And I highly recommend Lysander Spooner's essay on trial by jury. He's an enormously well read guy who's now dead, an American, a lawyer.
Trial by jury.
Yeah.
Trial by jury, Lysander Spooner. I'll put a description. I'll put a link in the description for other people to check out, and I'll make a note of checking it out myself. But sorry, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but just to cut in quickly, my point is yes, I agree with you. We do need to have that. But my point is this NAP law that we've established, the directive that it's laying down to whatever system we have is saying, that's fine, you can do that, but your directive is beyond reasonable doubt. It's what you're calling black and white. All right, now people might disagree with you and you'll enforce it on them, but you're going within the standard of black and white and beyond reasonable doubt. You're not dictating an area that you yourself are conceding is a grey area. And I know you think that I'm sorry, I'll let you carry on, but I just want to make that clarification. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think that's fine. Just very briefly, what Lysander Spooner does in his essay, it's quite sort of historical and it's quite long. He was a lawyer. He presents every point 3 times or 5 times in different ways. So it's a bit heavy for some readers, I think. But he looked very carefully at what Magna Carta is and what it was doing and what was the role of jury trial and what can you sort of infer were the Saxons doing and such like, and what parts of it were good and how has it been perverted over time. And broadly what he says is the jury, chosen by lot from all the citizens, obviously in those days communities were smaller, so there's challenges, but because it's chosen at random, it represents the cross-section of society. Obviously not exactly, but as well as it can. And given that you can't get the whole of society in a room to make a decision, 12 people, is a number that's been chosen. It's not written in stone, but it's obviously got to be manageable. You're going to need some procedures around that. But one of the most important things is that there is not a judge who makes the rules, and there is not a legislature which makes rules which are binding on the jury. The jury, and this is Spooner's claim, I think it's very hard because it's a historical claim, how do you prove it? But his claim is that, at the time of Magna Carta, there were no judges doing what judges now do, i.e. saying, the law is so long that you could never possibly read it or understand it, you, the accused, yeah, but I'm going to tell the 12 ordinary people who are meant to be as clever or as uninformed as you, because after all, they're ordinary people, yeah, they don't know the law. I'm going to tell them what it is, and they'll have to follow it. And if I tell them that they can't listen to a certain piece of evidence, then they can't listen to it. He's effectively a ruler, yeah. And so what Spooner says is 12 people in a room to hear the dispute, and their decision is final. Their decision cannot be appealed. Their decision, because who could be above them? And so I think there's more to it than that, of course, but understanding, I think this is the only alternative to having a legislature, to having a set of people who make the rules. And unfortunately, if a set of people make the rules, whether it's king or parliament, they will soon make the rules in their own favor, and they will ride roughshod over the self-ownership principle.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is I think to preserve the self-ownership principle, you can't ever have a ruler. You can't ever have anybody that's claiming that authority. Now, the thing that I think that potentially works with what you're talking about, at least within the concept of what I'm talking about, is that they're not violating the non-aggression principle law, like I say, as long as they're working under that directive of what they are calling the black and white, and what they're prepared to call the black and white. They're not claiming. I mean, just to go to I was just thinking of an example just then of like really simplifying it into like an almost like, it's much easier if we were like, wasn't so technological and all that. So let's go back to like different tribes and villages and communities representing like the potential different collectives. So say you've got your little collective and you live, and just over from you there's another little community that's their own little collective, and you've got your own little rules in the grey areas, but you've got this big non-aggression principle agreement that you're all part of, that's the overall free society, if you like, that you're all part of, but you're all part of your own little collectives. Now you've got your little court system, and maybe yours has a judge, and they've got their little court system, but maybe theirs has a jury system, and it's slightly different, but they've all agreed to abide by it, and that's fine. Now, what we're saying is what about when someone from their community infringes on you and you've got to pass judgment? What we're saying is you can still do that, but you can only do the black and white stuff. You can't do the grey area stuff. You've got authority with the grey area within your people that are agreed to be part of your community, but you don't have authority within the grey area. You can only do the black and white stuff. But how you get to that black and white determination, whether you've done it through, well, we decided we're going to let this judge determine, as long as he's still doing it under that directive of, reasonable certainty, and he declares this person is guilty of the murder and whatever. But then the other community, they also have their own little trial, because they're disputing it. This is a dispute over black and white now. Two different communities, both got their own little court systems, their own little judges, and are having a disagreement over the black and white, not grey area. They've agreed to let that to each other, the black and white certainty. So this person's saying this person's guilty, and they're saying no, they're not. They're not guilty. Okay, I'm saying, and I know it doesn't sound like a very satisfactory answer, but I'm saying in that scenario, they could potentially go to war, because in that scenario, they have a legitimate conflict over, like, one person wants to use force over a person. They basically have a conflict. They're agreeing on the principle, they're agreeing on general consensus of reality, but they're not agreeing on the reality of this specific scenario. They're having a disagreement over the facts. It's a little bit like, it's not exactly the same as obviously the coronavirus situation, but it's a little bit like if you take the coronavirus situation, if you had the side that want everyone vaccinated, if they were making the case, which some of them kind of try to do, but if they were making the case that everybody who's not vaccinated is directly endangering, like we're all giving off some kind of 5-mile radius, killing anybody of a certain type in within this rate, and if they're going to make that case as a reality thing, then from their point of view, the non-aggression principle would give them the right to force us all to get back, or force us to get away from the 5-mile radius that they claim. But we know that there's no such thing, and that's not based in science. So that's going to be a fight over that. What I'm saying is what I'm promoting here isn't solving that. It's nations of sanity. We need to be able to agree on basic consensus reality, and we need to be able to draw a black and white line and say, okay, if we're all agreeing to pursue beyond a reasonable doubt standards of not just whether someone's guilty, whether they committed the crime, but also whether we're determining whether something is a crime in the first place. Is it definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle? Is it definitely a child below that age? It's like all of these things. We're saying, okay, well, look, we've got our ideals that we want to establish through voluntary collective because we'd prefer to conduct that way, and there's loads of peaceful non-violent ways we can do that through voluntary association and regulated markets that we encourage and all the rest of it. But as a matter of forcing on everybody, whether they're part of our collective or not, that's when we have to only go by this more universal standard. And the fact that it is so basic, and the fact that it does leave potential for conflict, for me, rather than it being a flaw in the idea, which I can certainly understand it appearing as, but rather than it being a flaw in the idea, I actually see that as a built-in incentive to then establish these higher standards with these collectives. It's almost saying, look, we don't want to live only with the non-aggression principle law and nothing else guiding our actions and interactions together. We want higher standards than that. It's like the same with the regulated market. I want most of my consumer interactions in a regulated market. I don't want to buy my vegetables from some place that's got no real regulation outside of me launching a criminal investigation to make sure they're not secretly poisoning me. I want to be part of a regulated system. I might buy my eggs from my neighbor if I know him really well, and and he has chickens or whatever. That's fine. Like regulation doesn't have to be forced on us. But the reason it doesn't have to be forced on us, because in most cases it's desirable. In most cases it's a good idea. And it's the same with the voluntary collectives. It's the same with the negotiating the grey areas so we don't have conflict, and having this mechanism for all agreeing how we determine the black and white as well. All of these things are incentivized by the fact that if we don't do that, then things look a little bit more grim, but they're still within the realms of sanity. My point is even if the worst case scenario of us not doing any of those things, which would be almost like self-sabotage, it would be so negligent, but even in the scenario of us doing none of those things, but just having the non-aggression principle law and this understanding of being able to enforce that universally at a black and white, beyond reasonable doubt level of interpretation, even if that's all we had, we would have a sane society as much as it might have other problems. And I just feel like if we have that as our foundation, we can build on the things that you're talking about. I don't disagree with that. I think that's actually what you're saying is correct. We do need that. But I'm just saying it's like, we can't force people on that. I think we can just say, look, this is the best way to do this. And this is the best way for us to function going ahead and structuring it like this. But, like good ideas don't require force. The only thing that requires force is defending self-ownership. And that's something that we do with force when we're certain that that's what we're doing. I hope that all makes sense.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I just wondered whether you could answer me a couple of other questions.
Yeah, gladly.
Possibly questions with no answer, but one of them is about property and labour, and I guess the field is huge, isn't it? But a lot of people, and I think including Rothbard and I believe you, will say that property comes from labour. Is that how? Yeah, the property comes from labour.
I would say. Sorry, go on.
I think. Sorry, just to be more precise, and
Hmm.
there are many formulations of it, I think. But was it Locke who said that property arises when a person mixes his labour with the resources of the world. I think he used the word land, really, but that's what it stood for. And I think what he has in mind is man comes to a wooded place, decides to chop down trees in order to grow crops or whatever it is, or build a house. And it was owned by no one before. Now it's owned by him. That's property. And so there, it's the mixing of the labor somehow. Now, to me, labor is time and effort. I can't mix it. I can mix eggs and flour. I can't mix that concept with some soil or something, or it's totally ill-defined. And I also think of work. If I work for you in your factory, yeah, I come in, I sit at my bench, I screw the things together that you want fixed together, yeah, and then I go home at night, and you pay me a wage. Now I'm definitely mixing my labour with those nuts and bolts, but the nuts and bolts don't become mine. So the mixing, the property arises. Now, what I say, so I'll just finish. I know it's a long one.
Sorry, go on.
I say that property arises. So property is control of something in the world. If I control something and I rightly control it, justly control it, then we call it property. So the justly comes from the rules of society, and the coming into control. I can come into control of something that no one controls, because after all, if no one controls it, then no one has the right to stop me. Yeah, and now I control it, and now I have a right to stop them. So that's appropriation or whatever you call it, and I think that's what Locke was getting at with his mixing labour. But it doesn't. But once so let's say. Who owns the nuts and bolts at the end after you've, I've forgotten, I was working in your factory. I did my work, I went home. The nuts and bolts belong to you before I touched them, and they belong to you afterwards. Obviously, we had an agreement on wages, which is where you hand over some of your property to me, because I'm spending my time and effort doing this stuff. But so property comes, yes, it comes from appropriation at the start, like taking control of something that no one controls. But thereafter, the property is a continuum, and only obviously it can change owners if we make an exchange or a gift or whatever, or I can abandon it and then it becomes unowned again. But I don't see how property arises from labour.
Well, the way I conceptualize it is I don't link it to labour per se. I mean, labour is obviously involved, but it's kind of incidental. It's not like the defining part of where you're getting property ownership from. Like the reason why your labor, you can combine your labor with something to own it as property, comes, and like everything, comes from self-ownership. It comes from the fact that you have right over yourself. And I mean, the way I like to sort of talk about it is I say, look, we're all of us are all having right over ourselves. If there's like a little spot over there, none of us have exclusive right to it because we're all equal. We just have right over ourselves. But you go and stand over there. Now, all of a sudden, you control that spot because you control yourself. You have right over yourself. And it's not because you had any divine right over that spot. It's just because you went over there first. And now for me to now stand in that spot, I would have to aggress against you. I'd have to invade your personal space and violate your self-ownership. Now, the same thing would happen. I mean, this is the funny thing, because like even the commies will talk about occupancy and use, but then they reject like property ownership. Yeah, they don't seem to understand that both come from self-ownership in the exact same way. Why is my occupancy and use of any validity? Like, why, just because I'm occupying this area, do I have right over you? Well, because we all have equal right over ourselves. Then it's whoever's occupying and using the area that would have the superseding right, not because they've got a divine right to it, but just because they were there first. Like, and if it was the other way around, then the other person would have because they were there first, and it would be aggression for you to remove them and all the rest of it. Now, the exact same thing happens if I then create property. So I transform this tree into a lovely table and chairs because I'm an expert carpenter, and now this is property. It's no longer the tree; it's now a table and chairs. And
you own the tree?
Say again, sorry.
Did you own the tree?
No, nobody owns the tree. Let's say I'm as long as my use of the tree isn't causing some harm in some kind of way that people can talk about, like someone's got their house built in the tree or something, or or whatever.
In that case, they owned the tree, didn't they? Because they'd taken control of it. They were using it.
I wouldn't say they don't necessarily have to own the tree. It's like you don't have to own the air around you for me not to be allowed to pollute it. It's part of your environment. It's attached to your property in a sense, but I wouldn't say it necessarily has to be classed as your property. But let's just say, like, for example, I mean, it's like the way I say it, with self-ownership, the non-aggression principle dictates that you can do what you want with yourself or your rightfully owned property as long as you're not violating anybody else. So it's like with regards to the tree, if I'm cutting down a couple of trees in the forest, then I don't think anybody can make any kind of reasonable claim that I'm violating anybody. We've all got equal rights to the tree. If they've got right to cut it down, I've got right to cut it down. Now, if they say, for example, I level an entire forest and cause some kind of shift in the environment, cause some kind of water thing that collapses a local village, or, like there are ways in which people can say that I'm doing something that would affect other people without them having to make a direct property right claim on whatever it is I'm messing with. If I could mess with a stream, if I built a dam on a river, they don't have to own the river.
Yeah. With their property or their person, one way or another.
Exactly. So I have to admit, I've lost my thread as to what I was.
Sorry, it was the tree and ownership, and I think whether you've made it.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Just to go back to I was just saying. Look, what I'm saying is like I own that property. I created those trees. So sorry, I created not the trees. I created the table and the chairs from the trees. So that property is now my property. I created that. Now, if someone paid me, the reason I create that is because I own myself. The reason I own my labor, if you like, is because I own myself. But because I own my labor, I can rent it out to somebody else. Just like you own your car, but I could give it to you and you could do a taxi job with it, and all. So it's the same sort of thing. But so the same self-ownership that allows me to own a house that I build with my own bare hands also allows somebody else to own a house that I build with my own bare hands if I agree to rent out my labor to them. It's kind of like in that sense. So that's why I say like labor is kind of connected to how we acquire property, but not in a way that you necessarily own everything you create, because you could agree that somebody else will own what you create as part of a voluntary agreement to do it under that circumstances, or if they own the resources and like they can hire you and all the rest of it. But if no one's hiring you, if you just come across some resource that nobody else owns or has a right to, and you're not involved in any other agreement, and you create something, then the reason why that's your property is because nobody else has a claim to it other than you. You're the only one who did create it. It's that whole thing of sorry.
But I do think that in your example, and of course it kind of doesn't happen nowadays because every bit of land is owned and almost everything is owned. But when you come across the tree that isn't owned and you take control of it, that's when you gain property, and you gain property in the tree. Now, if you transform it into a table and chairs, that doesn't change property at all. It changes obviously the form of the thing, but you had property in the tree because you appropriated it. You were the first person to take control of it. And the question of how much work you spent, how little or much work you spent making it into a table, is neither here nor there.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, one person, I had a similar conversation with somebody who used the example of a sandcastle. He was saying, okay, well, look, I don't own the sand. I'm on the beach and I make myself a sandcastle. Do I own that sandcastle? Is that my property? And I say, yeah, it is. And he goes, but why? I don't own the beach. I say, yeah, but you don't have to own the beach. You only own the sandcastle. Now, you can abandon it, as most people do. They're not too stringent about enforcing property rights over their sandcastles. But technically, if you wanted to, you could, slice under it, put it in a box, try to preserve it, freeze it, whatever. You know what I mean? You could stay there. You could, you could have a little sign that says no one's allowed to touch my sandcastle. And if you got the time and energy to enforce that, you would have the right to do that. You still don't own the rest of the beach because you've not, done anything with that, and you probably wouldn't be able to acquire it anyway because it probably involved violating others in some way. But no one can make a claim against your sandcastle. That's your property. Now, someone says, okay, well, what if it's not really a sandcastle? What if it's just like a mound of sand? All I've done is mush a bit of sand together. No one can call that a sandcastle. The same applies, just as you mentioned. It doesn't matter how good the work is or how much work okay, all right, if it's just a pathetic mound, it's my pathetic mound. And if I want to say that's my mound and no one else is allowed to touch it because it's a work of art in my mind, that's fine. Now, obviously, if I left it and abandoned it, I haven't got a reasonable expectation that anyone's even going to know that that's a man-made mound that someone's claiming as property or anything. There's still got to be that kind of, just like if you left if you saw in a car that looked like it was abandoned because it had been there for years and it was all rusty and everything, you think, okay, well, no one's claiming that. Like there's still like that reasonable expectation of what people can interpret. But at the end of the day, technically, as a matter of property rights, that little mound of sand is now your property because you made it. And if you want to sit there and say this is my property and take a picture of me with it and whatever, and no one's allowed to. What I'm saying is if someone came in and kicked it over, just like if someone kicked over your sandcastle, technically they're aggressing against you. It's not a particularly high level violation of the non-aggression principle. We're not, but like a serial sandcastle destroyer. But technically, they're aggressing. That would be an act of aggression, and it wouldn't matter how good your sandcastle is. If you're in Nap Court and you were making your case saying, well, it wasn't even a sandcastle, judge. It was just it was just a hill, really, and I just kicked it over. It's like, yeah, but he made that hill, and you had no right to kick it over.
I like that. I think it still comes. I suppose the beach is chosen because we think that beaches are maybe unowned.
I use that as a good example, but yeah,
that all beaches are owned, and then you're sitting on there making your sandcastle.
But one thing I will,
under some terms of the owner.
True, but I will say though, I mean, one thing I did meant to say when you said it before, actually, about almost everything is owned now, not legitimately. Not everything is owned legitimately, and I think in a free society with property rights going through the non-aggression principle filter of being whether they're valid or not, a lot of what is currently owned, like beaches and forests and lakes, would go back to being unowned because the property right claim wouldn't be valid over it. Where it's valid, and like I say, I think the non-aggression principle lays that out nice and simply. No one's having their property seized, but where they're making arbitrary claims over certainly natural resources and, like I say, lakes and oceans.
I don't know what you mean.
Okay. Well, when I say natural resources, I mean like you could say your house is natural resources, but it's not. That's property now. It's not a naturally occurring forest. Like we can all walk into the forest, we can't all walk into your house. There's that distinction. And what I'm saying is currently in our current society, a lot of beaches, forests, lakes, what we would call naturally, parts, what should be considered parts of our shared natural environment, are currently treated as people's private property. And at the risk of sounding like a commie, that's wrong. It's not valid. And I don't say that because I don't agree with, because I do agree with private property and I do recognize that as valid. But there's a lot of invalid property claims, particularly with regards to land and natural resources. And like I say, your lakes, your forests, your oceans, no one has right to make property right claims over that. Now, people that are fishing in certain areas. Sorry,
you just said land. You included in your list land.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you distinguish between certain areas of land. It almost sounds like if I cut down the trees on my land, then they're kind of my trees. I can make a house out of them. But if they're standing, then they're a forest, and they're kind of I'm not really allowed to own it. Or I'm not allowed to do stuff. And I think one of the
it's not that you're not allowed to do stuff, but if it was just if there was a forest that was just there as a forest and you haven't done anything, then what right would you have to say that it's your property and no one else can use it? Whereas if you cut it down and created your own house,
I got there first. Yeah, I got there first, and I built my fence around, a square mile of it or whatever it might be. Let's not say it's a whole wilderness, because I don't see how I could, there would be a dispute, I'm sure, over whether I controlled that or not. But for the bit I control, that becomes my property. And I don't see a basis. I mean, it's an interesting question about the sea, for example. I suppose that's the biggest unowned resource. I think really all forests are owned. And,
well, if they're not privately owned, then they're owned by the government under the auspice of being publicly owned, so they're owned one way or another. Yeah,
they are owned, exactly. I think self-ownership leads to property rights, and property rights means you can't say, well, you own it, but in fact you don't own it. If you're going to show that, if you're going to say you must now give up certain rights over this land that you thought you owned, you're going to have to prove something before the jury or whoever is entitled.
But you've got to qualify. But sorry to interrupt, but you've got to qualify your ownership. It's like when you said about putting a fence around a quarter-mile section of forest. I mean, it's like, because the thing is like, well, where would that end? You know what I mean? Could I fence off North America if, let's say before, obviously there's a lot of private property there and stuff like that, but let's say, at the beginning, could, like, say the Native Americans just fence off the entirety of the North American continent and say, okay, well, this is our area. What I'm saying is there's a difference between the land, because the thing is the land that you're occupying and using with your rightfully owned property, like you build a house or even you have farmland and the crops and all the rest of it, all of this is attached to something that we can definitely say is your rightfully owned property. The land itself is really just the space you're taking up with your rightfully owned property. It's not itself your rightfully owned property, at least not in the way I kind of conceptualize it. So from my point of view, the reason why you can't just sort of and this is why I object to the enclosure movement, because you can't just fence off large swathes of land that you've got no real property right claim on outside of the fact that you fenced it off. You know what I mean? And just like made this, this is my area now. If you build a house, if you or build a factory, whatever you're building, if you're establishing some property and you're doing so without infringing on others and harming others and all the rest of it, then carry on as you are. But the problem is when people start, but their property right claim over the area, like the land and the resources, only kind of goes with what they're actually occupying. It's a little bit like if we're having a picnic in a field. Let's say that there's this commons field. I know they don't exist in the real world, but let's say there's this commons field that we can all go to and have our little picnics. And you're having your picnic over that area, and I'm having my picnic over this area. But let's say we want to start encroaching and all the rest of it and each other's. I say, okay, well, no. You've got to stay over in that very little corner of the field because I'm fencing off the rest of this area, and this is all now mine. Even though I'm actually only having this little picnic in this little corner, I'm claiming the rest. You would quite rightly say, no, that's not valid. Just like I would say that you would say that it's not valid if I tried to say that you're infringing on my personal space because you walk within 100 feet of me. You know what I mean? Whereas obviously I can say if you're walking within 2 feet of me. What I'm saying is people can't, well, people can, but what I'm saying is, and this comes back to this limits of tolerance thing over the differing interpretations. People will always try to take the piss and say, okay, well, this is my garden. My garden is, so I'm gonna build a house next to the Amazon rainforest, and I'm going to just build a fence all the way around the Amazon rainforest, and that's my garden now, and no one else is allowed in it. You can't do that. Now people say, okay, well, what if you leveled all? You still can't do it. You can't. There's no way you can do that without infringing on other people, because once you enclose such a large area of land and you're infringing on people's right to move and stuff like that, it's a little bit, and again, it does come down to degree a little bit, but it's a little bit like, because some people take it too far. They say, well, if you build your house anywhere, you're stopping me from walking that place. That it gets ridiculous. It's like, but there's a difference between like me having my house and you having to walk round it, or me having this giant fence that covers acres and acres of land that is otherwise untouched, that I've not even made any valid property right claim over. You know what I mean? It's like, that's for me when the property claim becomes arbitrary. That's why I always think that property rights has to stay faithful to self-ownership and just come from that. Like it's almost like using the commies occupancy and use, but just saying, well, yeah, that's how you get property, because you're occupying and using these natural resources and forming them into a property that you've created, and that's now your property.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think we kind of get lost when we go back in time. But since you mentioned North America, I'm sure the Indians felt that they owned those lands. They're not, in common. I think it was their approach, but they were their lands, and the European settlers took them by force in many cases, sometimes by trickery and such like, and no doubt sometimes by paying. And so there were lots of violence. Had there been no one there, and the European settlers had simply gone and fenced out their bits, some would have fenced off bits bigger than they could chew, as it would be, and whatever dispute resolution mechanism they had would have decided, no, actually, you can only have 50% of what you've just done. And they had such resolution mechanisms, and they worked. They were rulers. They were directed by a ruler. But my point is, that's in the past. The present that we face is that pretty much all of the Earth's surface, apart from oceans, is owned by somebody, whether it's a government or whether it's a private person. Unless you are going to go full commie and just tear up property rights and say, oh, it doesn't exist, and in fact the government owns it all, which of course even the communists don't say that property doesn't exist, they just want a different person to own it, really. But unless you're going to give up property rights in total, then you're going to have to accept that the current owner is the owner of it, unless someone else can prove a better title.
I push back on that a little bit, because I think I know what you're saying, but the problem is that the property ownership, it has to be valid. Like it's like, just to go, I know it seems a bit of a cop out to go back to historical examples, but just to invoke the Native Americans again, like they might have. I mean, a lot of them had different, views and attitudes over different things like property rights and stuff. And a lot of them were nomadic, so that they had their property rights with regards to their teepees and their little areas where they'd set up camp, but then they'd move on, and then that, and all the rest of it. But my point is like when the Europeans went over there, certainly when they directly aggressed against Native Americans, obviously with actual warfare and what have you, which obviously occurred. But when they killed off their food source, the bisons, without the Native Americans having a direct property right claim over the bisons, because they were wild animals, it would be like and although they didn't poison the lakes, but it's like if they went over there and poisoned the lakes and stuff like that, all of that would be aggression. But just going over there on its own wouldn't be aggression. So if Europeans went over to North America and just kind of, as best as they could, try to like go into places without interfering with the Native Americans in any kind of way, but still obviously encroaching on their lands, if you like, then as far I know, this doesn't mean it's going to happen that way, but the NAP law would say that there's no aggression there. The Native Americans don't own all of those lands, and many of them by their own ideologies don't think they own it, but even if they did, whether they think it or not is irrelevant. There's no valid property right claim they have over all of these natural lands, all of these areas. They have property right claims over their teepees and their actual property, and they also have certain rights of dominion and rights of use and occupancy and all the rest of it over, with regards to like I say, if we killed off their bison, then we're aggressing against them. If we poison their rivers, then we're aggressing against them, even though they don't directly own any of that, because we're messing with their environment, we're messing with their preset activities and all the rest of it. It's like, if you had a house and a driveway, I don't get to block your driveway even if it's off your property. You know what I mean? And you don't have to own. It doesn't always have to be directly your property that's being violated for me to be aggressing against you. I can mess with unowned things around you, and that can still be an act of aggression against you, like poisoning your air, blocking out the sunlight to your house, blocking your access. Like, and that's one of the things the enclosure movement did. I mean, that was an insidious form of theft. And it's the sort of thing that the commies point to as why they don't like property ownership and see it as invalid. And this is why I say we've got to give them their credit where they're pointing out something that was wrong, even by our own conception of property rights. The enclosure movement was wrong because all these basically all of these peasants that were just living on land that they had just as much right to live on was then all of a sudden claimed as the private property of somebody else, and all of a sudden they got to pay this and they got to pay that, and it's like none of that's valid. So that's why I totally get your point. We can't go all commie and just say, oh, we're not having property ownership, but we've got to set limits on how far people can stretch the interpretation of what property is and how you can actually call something your rightfully owned property and how you can justify denying it to others. And the problem is when that's applied to these giant areas of beaches and oceans and what have you, it's like I should be allowed to go and visit, say, for example, the Grand Canyon without asking anyone's permission. I should be able to walk through any forest. I should be able to go to any lake. None of these things should be private unless it was like someone built their own lake or something, you know what I mean? But like all of these naturally occurring parts of our environment, I should be able to access. Now, I shouldn't be able to go into your house. I shouldn't be able to go into your garden. And I shouldn't be able to go to any of these naturally occurring places that I do have a right to go to if going to them involves some kind of, I can't drive a tank through this, and you know what I mean? It's like all of these things are still restricted by the non-aggression principle and me aggressing against people and what have you. But the fact of the matter is when other people make a property right claim over something they don't have a valid property right claim over, then they're aggressing because they're preventing people from going places that they have no right to prevent them. Like, people that can't go and live in the forest because all the forests are privately owned. And that's wrong. And for me, I see no valid reason why these people say, oh, well, this estate's been in my family for generations. Yeah, but where's their right to own it? Where did that ever come from? And that's my problem with those.
I think again, to talk about forests and lakes as if they're particular things. I suppose you have certain size things in mind, but it's arbitrary. If you have property rights, then the people who own it now, property only exists really in society because it's society's rules that say that the piece of land that you were sitting in yesterday but aren't sitting in today is still treated as controlled by you. Yeah, it's society's rules. So the basic societal rule has to be that you own and continue to own what you have once owned, unless you give it away or exchange it, or unless someone else can show a better title to it, can show, for example, that you stole it, yeah, or that you aggressed against someone, which is stealing it effectively. Okay, so the only way to challenge a current property title without tearing up everything that you believe in terms of property rights and self-ownership is to use whatever the agreed process is in your society, whether it's jury trial or something else, and to make a specific claim against that owner, so the person who's currently controlling it, and to say, I can demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt or whatever standard you want to do it to, that you stole that from my father or whatever it might be.
But like, for example, to use the example of the forest, like, so what would your argument be? Like, say I come in and say, look, this is just a forest. No one owns this and no one can own this, what's your counter argument to that? Like when you say you're defending the person who says, oh, no, I do own all of this forest because I bought it off the government or whoever, years ago and stuff. When you're like, say we're in our little court now and I'm making the case for he doesn't have a valid property ownership, we're actually disputing this now, and you're saying, what is your argument? What's your case to say, well, no, he does have a valid property right because of
again, it has to be the person who claims that the title is not valid has to make the argument, because the person who owns something, you've got to prove to some reasonable doubt or whatever standard it is that the shirt I'm wearing is not my shirt. And maybe you can, maybe I took it, but you can't say that I have to prove ownership of what I.
Okay, but the reason why, and this is why I think there is a distinction between like a tree and a table and a forest and a shirt, because we can work on the default that property, like clear property, like a shirt is clearly property. It's not a naturally occurring resource or part of our environment, you know, like, so we can assume ownership there. We can assume that there's a valid property ownership. So there's no reason to assume that it's not your shirt if you're wearing it. And yeah, I should innocent until proven guilty, and all the rest of it comes into play with that. But the reason why I'm saying I feel like I've got a stronger case with the forest thing is because when you say, well, you got to prove that I don't. Well, I'm saying, well, there's no possible way you could own it. Is my point? Is like, you didn't make this forest. It's not your property in any way that's consistent with property rights. Like the way in which you can own your house because you built it, the way in which you can own a area of farmland because you're occupying and using that, doesn't apply to a forest that you've left untouched. That's just no different to how it was when you found it. It's just, like I say, it's just a part of our natural resource.
But hang on, isn't conserving forests a great thing that owners do, and people who like conservation would like them to do? So, and wasn't London a forest? To say that the forest that existed before London was built.
Your second statement contradicted your first.
You did? Sorry.
Your second statement contradicted your first.
Oh, okay, I can't remember what it was, but
well, you said isn't owning like forests a great way to preserve them, and then you said, and wasn't London once a forest once? And I think that kind of shows that it's not a great way to preserve forests, because once you own a forest, then you can tear it down and do what you want with it. And yes, some people do own them just to preserve them, but some people own them just to tear them down and destroy them. And
my point on those two different things is. First of all, a forest is the land before you cut it down to build a house and a fence and keep animals and all those good things. If you don't do those things, then there will be more trees and more furry animals, but less humans. And self-ownership, given that you've got your child now to feed, you need more food, you cut down the tree. It doesn't mean you despoil the land. A property owner tends to conserve his property because he owns the long-term value of it, and the only way to maximize that is to treat it well. Now, of course, some people make mistakes and some people don't think of the long term, so I'm not saying it's 100%. But for us, my point about the London point is we look at a forest now which is owned by someone, and we think it's a special thing which should be treated differently as a property right from a bit of London garden or whatever it is. And the only difference is that someone came and cut down the tree earlier. That's the only difference between your two bits. And he owns this one. Now, it was a long trail of how someone came to own how someone comes to own a bit of forest today. Okay, lots of it is owned by the government, but probably if we went through the parcels of forest in the United States that are owned by individuals or perhaps corporations, then it would be a long train of things. It wouldn't always have been forest, probably some of it might have had different trees planted in it, etc. And looking after a forest, making sure that brushwood is cut or things are done so that the trees don't all burn down or whatever it might be. It's not always evident what the owner is doing. And my point about conserving forests is, even if the owner is just saying, I'm going to leave it virgin, I'm going to wild it, is a form of ownership. He probably has to put up fences and look after it to make sure that wild environment is preserved. And so I think that, oceans is a very interesting one, because oceans are it's kind of like roads, we all have trouble with roads, and oceans is sort of like, well, if you own all the ocean around me and now I'm cut off from trade, I think it's a ridiculous example, really, because everyone does better by trade, and so no one does that blocking. But all the bits of land, pretty much in the world, are owned by someone, and if you go into it, you'll find there's a long train of ownership, with no one having a better right. You'll find obviously some aggressions and such like, where you could say, well, if that person or anyone who was related to him was still alive and made the claim, then they would probably have a good claim. Whether they would get passed in today's society is another matter. But for all the ones where you couldn't find that bit of aggression, you would simply go back, if you could go back far enough in history, to the first appropriator, the first person who turned up in a virgin piece of forest and appropriated it. And most people, of course, appropriated the amount that they could deal with, because they couldn't stop someone nearby. There was no, police force or whatever it was to stop the guy nearby. So, the people ended up with the bit that they could control. And so we come down to modern day, and you have to say, well, it is all owned, and in fact, because ownership is such a positive thing, I mean, generally the owner conserves, and we should see property as a good thing. It's an essential part of self-ownership, and I feel it's a dream world to think. I don't mean to be rude, because I'm sort of accusing you of dreaming, but dreaming is nice. But in practicality, it's a thing where you say, well, I know what it is with my house and car, and certain rules apply, but there's a big area about over there which I don't know, and it looks green or something, and so different rules apply over there. But actually, there's a guy, the same guy as you over there, and he owns this bit of forest, and he, whether he's Indian or whatever, he treats it as his property, in just in the same way that you think of your house as your property.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I mean, a lot of these people don't think of it as their property. They take a slightly different view on it. But my point is because I mean, I mostly agree with you. I mean, obviously, we're obviously slightly quibbling over this aspect with regards to where the property rights extend to. But obviously, I'm not opposing property and making like the communistic argument in that sense. But it's like, for example, the reasons why the oceans can't be owned, there's actually two reasons. One, again, there's no way in which anyone could like establish ownership. It's not property in any sense. It's like, like I say, it's part of our natural resources, but also the property right. Like, for example, like the thing is about the enclosure thing. I know you said, I know it sounds like a practically ridiculous thing. Oh, I can't go anywhere because they own the oceans all around me and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is that fact alone is one of the reasons why they can't own the oceans around you, because they can't, like, I can build a donut-shaped house, but I can't build a donut-shaped house that surrounds yours and encloses you. You know what I mean? This is that whole thing about my property ownership. It's not about the size. It's not about how much I own. It's not about like even what specifically I own or where it's being applied. It's more about like the implications of that. The implications of me owning a donut house has no effect on you. But the implications of me owning a donut house that encloses you does have an effect on you. The implications of me owning entire oceans does have an effect on you, especially if I'm claiming some right to stop you from sailing on them or fishing in them or doing whatever. And it's the same with the Native American or the tribal person or whatever, who maybe they think they own the forest, or maybe they take a more traditionalist view that no one does and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is from a property rights point of view, they have a right to claim that we're aggressing if we're somehow destroying the forest in a way that's disturbing their way of life, like destroying like the, thing, like I say, and they don't even have to have a direct property right claim there. But in fact, actually, I will use one example because I know what you're saying, because there are many instances where people owning property, having a property right claim over natural resources has protected it. But I mean, I think the Brazilian rainforest is a good example of where that goes spectacularly wrong, because the Brazilian rainforests, it's a big issue about how that's being destroyed and the pollution and the effects and that it's having on not just the planet as a whole, but obviously the indigenous people there, the tribal people that live there, and as well as people living around that area. Now, all of that's been allowed to happen because the Brazilian government and the various corporations that they've sold property rights to have claimed ownership over all of that forest. Now, my point of view is the NAP law would say that they don't own that forest, and like the tribal people that live there,
because the tribal people owned it.
Well, no, the tribal people that live there, they don't own it either, but they have a certain right of domain because they do have obviously certain property rights within their homes, within there, and all the rest of it. It's like we can't. It's an essential part of their natural environment where they do live and where they do have valid property right claims. So. But my point is as it currently is, the Brazilian government, and I mean, they have that Bolsonaro now who's very like almost declared open war on the tribes there and basically said, look, I'm selling off all your land, you got to get off. And it's like, the reason he's able to do that now, if you could say, well, if the person who owned the rainforest had more of a conservationist bent, then great, he would protect it and he would maybe be more compassionate towards the indigenous people. But if someone who got more of an attitude of this Bolsonaro guy, he's going to take it in another direction. He's going to sell it off. He's going to destroy it. He's going to, because there's profit in that, and there's always ways, in which people can profit from destroying our environment, often more than they can when they're preserving it. My point is according to the non-aggression principle, according to a consistent application of property rights, Bolsonaro and the Brazilian government have no right to do any of that. Now, the indigenous tribes that live there, they don't own the land in the sense that they could prevent other people from coming in and also using the forest, and as long as they're doing it without interfering with them in any kind of way. As soon as they start, encroaching on them in some kind of way that they can say, look, you're harming me in some way or damaging this, or this is, whatever. But so what I'm saying is nobody owns that forest. This is what we're saying. It's part of our shared natural environment. Like, not everything is property. We're all born on this planet. So much is property and so much is owned, and that's fine. Like I say, if it's validly owned, it's fine. But it's almost like we've taken it too far by trying to say, right, where everything is property and it's got to be owned by somebody. And it's like, well, no, we can share the planet, we can share the natural resources, we can acquire property without violating each other, as long as we do so without violating each other. And we can then build property that is ours, exclusively ours, that we can control, and we can have our, we can live our lives. We were here first, we were fishing in these waters. Like I say, we don't have to own the lake. We can fish in these lakes, and you don't get to come over and destroy the lake and turn it into a sewage system or whatever you want to do with it, because we were here fishing here. You know what I mean? We don't own the lake, but it's part, it's part of our natural environment. And it's like, I suppose that's where I'm coming from. And that's not from a point of view of being against property rights, but just saying, I think we protect property rights better by not letting them go beyond where they really should, because they come from self-ownership, as far as I'm concerned. Like, the reason you own. Go on. Sorry.
Just take your example. I mean, I know nothing about Bolsonaro,
okay.
But governments tend to do bad things. They set up monopolies, they give privileges. It's all very bad news. But just taking your example at face value, without commenting on it, I think that you are expressing the idea that those in the forest dwellers have a right over their natural habitat, or whatever you call it. Presumably they gather, maybe they gather fruits, or maybe they grow things in some part of it. And although we don't call that, we might not register, it's not registered in a title book. It is the same thing. They were the first people there, and if they began to do off their own back what other people in other parts of the world started to do, and say, well, actually, I want to clear away of this forest and make my field, because that's a better way to live. They would, the forest would become broken into pieces, looked after better, I think, than when it's in the hands of a monopoly, because monopolies and governments particularly exploit things because they're not going to be there for the long term. Whereas the Indian or the peasant or whatever you say, or the owner of a flat in London looks after it because it's his bit that he owns. His property rights are secure, so yes, I think there's lots of bad things happen, but it's not because there should be bits of the world that somehow are our garden to look at, and the people who live in it are to kind of be preserved in their way, whether they like it or not. I think the fact is, what we're against is the monopolist ruler type government who says, yeah, go on guys, bulldoze it, but you've only got a 5-year concession. So
yeah, I understand what you're saying. I suppose I'm just saying that they don't have to own the whole rainforest to be able to protect it as part of their natural environment. They can just own, like they can have direct property right claims over their direct homes, and then they've obviously got their way of life that they've established. The rest of it's just part of their natural environment, and other people coming in and claiming property ownership over it is an aggression against them. Whether and destroying the forest around them is aggression against them, even if they're destroying parts of the forest that they don't have a direct, that's not actually it's like you live in a forest and someone burns the entire forest around you. They're aggressing against you even without you making any claim of owning that forest. They're still making that act of aggression against you. So I suppose that's why I was resistant against saying, when you said, were you saying that it's the Native Americans, they should be the rightful owners? I'm not saying, well, they don't really own like the whole forest either. They obviously own what they have that valid right to own. And it's like they could clear a bit of forest and do that rest of it, as long as they're not violating others. If they're doing it in a way that would violate others, then they couldn't. And it's not about them necessarily being local, because it's not like some Chinese company that wants to clear a little bit of the forest or whatever that no one's using, and it's not violating anyone and causing any harm. Again, not got an issue with that, because again, they're not violating anybody's rights along the way. It's when they enclose a big area and say, right, this is all ours, and now we've got that property ownership of it, we can treat it as property, which means we can do what we want with it. And when they're doing that to these giant sections of rainforest, which they're able to do because there's this preset property ownership, rather than it being recognized as part of our shared. Sorry, go on.
Isn't it really because they've got the power?
It is that ultimately. But what I'm saying is the pretense on what they're working on is saying, well, this is valid because we're the rightful owners. And I suppose what I'm saying is if we were proper consistent under NAP law and applying property rights properly, we wouldn't protect it by saying, oh, well, no, we want a benevolent owner to own it all. We would say, no. You don't get to destroy it because you don't own it, and no one owns it, and it's part of our shared environment, and destroying it would harm these people here and these people here, and you know what I mean. It's like you don't have any valid, you don't get to make the world your garden. You know what I mean? You don't get to fence off arbitrary areas and say, right, that's mine now. It's like, I remember I had a conversation with Walter Block once when he said about, well, what if someone landed on the moon and planted their flag and say, right, I own the moon now? Again, it wouldn't be valid. Now, if they wanted to build a house, they'd own that house, and they'd obviously have that domain over the area where their house was. But if someone else wanted to land on a different part of the moon, as long as they weren't encroaching, again, it's all about encroaching and all the rest of it, then they can it's about, I suppose, again, it's hard to draw that exact line, but it's about that. It's about getting arbitrary with it. It's like, I can come in and say, okay, right, I'm building my house here, so this is my property now, and I'm obviously occupying. We have to occupy an area of land to have property. So there's a certain, even if you're against land ownership, there's a sort of quasi land ownership that comes with property ownership as an inevitable thing, because you have to occupy land. So that's the same thing. But my point is the property rights is it's still restricted by that self-ownership. You own your house, you've got a dominion over the area that you're occupying and using with yourself and your rightfully owned property, but you start making arbitrary claims, oh, I own 5 miles that way and 5 miles that way, when you don't have any actual claim other than maybe putting a fence around it or planting a flag or something. That's when we say, no, that's arbitrary, just like we would with standards of personal space. And again, it's like you've got the right to dictate the gray area, because that's the other thing as well. It's about that black and white and gray area, because there's that limit of tolerance, but then there's the gray area, and if it's a gray area thing, then, like, let's say 50 feet away from me, I can't say, black and white, I can't say that you're encroaching my personal space. 2 foot away from me, I can. Let's say 4 foot, it's a gray area, but I'm already there and you're approaching me, so I can say, excuse me, but don't come any closer, and it's not black and white, I mean, that gray area, because you're the one invading me, then I have the right to sort of say, please don't come any closer. But if it's black and white, if you're that far away, I don't have the right to say don't step closer when you're 50 foot away or 40 foot away, and you get closer and closer, and we draw those limits of tolerance. And it's the same with property, how far we can take our property right claims. Because like I say, I'm not against people doing all these things. You know, we all, like I say, the whole idea of saying that no one owns this shared environment is saying that we all have right to utilize it, as long as we do so in a way that's not violating others. And there's still a certain degree of reasonable interpretation, like, you know, the difference between sectioning off a little bit of their farmland and like what was done with the enclosure movement, where you're fencing off acres and acres of land and claiming ownership over everyone and everything in there, you know. So it's about drawing those distinctions, because I do agree with you, property rights is important and we can't lose them, but I think we're more danger of, well, not losing them, but I think they're stronger if we don't let them go beyond where they really firmly belong, you know, where it's firm and we can say that's definitely your property. And when we're dealing with a house you built, easy. When we're dealing with miles of forest and lake, that's when I struggle, you know. So it's and I do think there is a difference that can be pretty clearly distinguished between the two, you know.
I'm going to have to bring it to a close, I think. It's fantastic chatting with you. I really enjoy it. But I've kind of come to the end of my time, so we'll have to. I hope we can revisit.
Yeah, definitely. I'm enjoying these, and if you're willing to do another one, we'll do another one, because each conversation we dive a little deeper. I don't know about you, but it gives me lots of food for thought and things to churn over in my own mind. So, and hopefully anybody listening to this is could get something out of it as well. And yeah, we'll do a part 3 very soon.
Lovely. Great to speak to you. Thanks, Matthew.
And you. Thank you.